because it's not live.
No, that's
So
fine. That's fine. And you can edit this as you want to. So, way back, I started out doing surgery. The bariatric surgery is by far the single best way to lose weight, and also to restore medical health from all different kinds, diabetes, whatever it is, for a brief period of time. We're talking about a few years, 2 to 5 years at most. And the problem with most of the space, whether it's surgery or a ketogenic diet or the space that we're in, it is a therapeutic intervention for a condition called obesity or diabetes. And it's effective at treating the obesity and the diabetes, but it doesn't address the root cause. And if you think of obesity as the problem, then yes, you lose weight. But what are you going to do to keep it off? Obesity is not the problem. It's the consequence of the problem. The problem is, why did I get fat in the first place? So yes, you've got to treat the disease, but you've also got to treat the root cause. And I became more and more interested in my own life about, okay, why is this person obese? And what is it? And that's where it's just so obvious when you see it. That's where we came up with the concept of carbohydrate abuse, carbohydrate addiction, because the exclusive reason for obesity is a shift away from eating for the nutritional value toward eating for the emotional value of using sugar primarily as a drug. Gary Fettke says obesity is a dose response curve, and he's quite right. But there's a threshold where it's like alcohol. When you use it, you can abuse it, and then you become addicted to it. And once you're addicted to it, you've lost the relationship. So to go keto and lose some weight, great. But what are you going to do for the next 50 years of your life? What does that look like? And if you don't change your emotion management system, anytime life throws you a curveball, you're going to take a deep dive into a tub of ice cream again. And that's the problem. Really is the problem is relapse. Keto works great. And the biggest knock that anybody can give against it, I don't know what label I don't like the word keto, but low carb eating plans, the biggest knock on them is their sustainability. And they're unsustainable. No matter how committed you are, they're unsustainable unless you have other avenues of emotion management. Yeah. And most people don't. They've got carbohydrates and cobwebs in their emotion management toolkit. So you take out the carbs, what the hell are they going to do when life throws a curveball at them?
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, you were sort of a surgeon, and then you used to do a lot of heavy bariatric surgery. And then all of a sudden, you just realized that actually there was more of a demand to actually help change people.
Well, I think it's wrong to do surgery on somebody without addressing the cause. It would be malpractice to my mind to address. Let's say a guy comes into your practice and they've got COPD. They've destroyed their lungs from smoking. It would be malpractice to put them on medication for COPD and not address smoking. And yet, all my surgeon colleagues are addressing the obesity without ever addressing the carbohydrate addiction or the use of carbohydrates. And in fact, the diet they put them on is, if I was to design a diet to fail surgery, it would be the one that most of my surgical colleagues place them on. And they're so high and mighty about, we've got to see our psychologist and our dietitian, but they don't do. It's still a balanced diet. It's still a eat less, do more approach, and it doesn't work. Yeah. So it wasn't really intentional. It was vicarious that I realized, okay, if I'm interviewing all my patients, they all have the same pattern. We have to address that pattern, not just the weight, but the pattern. They come in wanting to lose weight. I try to shift them toward a methodology that helps them to recognize and understand how they manage emotional need first and work on that. And that's a lifelong thing. It's not, it continues even after you've lost the weight.
So does that mean that you are now, instead of giving medical consultations, giving almost life coaching consultations?
Well, to a certain extent, yes, but it's rolled into it. But I still do the medical side because it's impossible to be heavy and healthy. So you've got to look at the health sides and you use that as motivation. The weight loss, we're doing about 60% of our practice now is diabetes. But I also see a number of people already carnivore and things are not going so well. So the question now is, why I'm carnivore, it's supposed to be the healthiest diet out there. Why are my blood sugars going up? Why is my BUN going up? Why are some of my health parameters? So it's purely a health thing. It's not just a coaching thing, but it's got to involve some psychology, some nutrition, and then a large part of the medical practice. So we see that full spectrum of people. And yes, I still do surgery because there are still a lot of people who are invested in changing their emotion management system. but they keep tripping over their own feet. If you're a smoker and you've tried to quit smoking many times, of course, use a nicotine patch, use Chantix to help you to quit. Those are not going to do it. They're not alternatives. They're tools, they're adjuncts to help you to do better. And that's how surgery should fit in. So there's still a number of people that benefit from surgery, especially if they have struggled and failed, or they're a brittle diabetic or something like that. Don't take it off the table. But at the same time, invest very heavily with the patient. And I think in healthcare, we've become more and more a paternalistic system where we throw medication at people, we try to solve their problems. But more and more healthcare problems are patient caused. Where we call, you can't fix something that you caused yourself. The only person who can fix that is you. You've got to give them that guidance, but and there are some tools along the way to help them. But you cannot treat a diabetic to remission with medication.
Yeah.
Think about that. There's 99 medications for diabetes on the American Diabetes Association website, but nowhere do they say a low carb diet is the most effective therapeutic intervention.
Hasn't that changed though?
They've mentioned that low carb diets may help, but they refuse to believe that you can put type 2 diabetes into remission. Yet we do it every day in our practice. Every day.
But I mean, because like Virta Health does that, and they've got the study. It's like this is what we do, and people are like, I see that you guys do that, but we're just not going to say that.
Exactly right. The woman that Tracy Brown was a type 2 diabetic. She was the first African American or Black CEO of the ADA, and she put her own diabetes into remission by going low carb. But she was banned from talking about it. She was not allowed to talk about it. So she's now she's now the past president, or past CEO, or past CEO. But I mean, they forbid her from talking about it. So ADA, American Diabetes Association, which everyone looks to for their leadership, is primarily a pharmaceutical pushing society. It's like a lobby. It's a lobby group for pharmaceuticals. Yeah. Now it's got some reasonable stuff to it, but it is basically a lobby group for it. And at this stage, so much is known about more effective care for diabetes that they become a hindrance to the effective care of diabetes. I've got one type 1 diabetic that told me that the natural enemy of a type 1 diabetic is their endocrinologist, because my endocrinologist kept me diabetic. Now that it's type 1, but they were happy when the A1C was below 7. Well, this guy's A1C now is 4.7 through it with us.
Could you teach me a bit about type 1 diabetic? So it's a topic we very rarely discuss, but as I understand it, you can't reverse it, but you can manage it, or
So type 2 diabetes is basically the endpoint of insulin resistance. And in order to gain weight, and this is what a lot of people don't understand, in order to gain significant, I'm not talking about 2 or 3 pounds or 2 or 3 kilos. I'm talking about more than 40 or 50 pounds, 20 kilos. You have to be insulin resistant. The pathway to that is insulin resistance. So, and the endpoint of insulin resistance in some people is type 2 diabetes. So their pancreas is producing a lot of insulin, but it has no use. It's not able to function. It's blocked at the receptor level. So they have huge insulin production capacity or moderate insulin production capacity, but it's not working. On the other hand, if you destroy insulin production capacity and your pancreas is not able to produce insulin, that's called type 1 diabetes. And those people have to then supply external insulin to their bodies because they can't make it internally. So the one group, it's not working. They're producing a lot, but it's not working. The other group, they're not producing it. And the tragedy is that because of the glycemic index, because of the way they treat diabetics, they now have insulin resistance against the insulin they're injecting. So it's the same. So they've got the type 2 disease process against the insulin they're having to inject because their pancreas can't produce it. So all the damage that happens in a type 1 diabetic, and they have a lot of damage, brain damage, eye damage, heart cardiovascular damage, gastric intestinal damage, peripheral neuropathy, erectile dysfunction. I mean, it's basically the nervous system that gets attacked in these diabetics. Wow. They lose their toes, they lose their legs, they're much more prone to infection. Is not because they're type 1. It's because of the type 2 component of the type 1. In other words, their insulin resistance, their body is resistant to that insulin. Jeez. And so once they become insulin sensitive, which is basically what someone like yourself is, someone like myself. We're insulin sensitive because we don't eat carbohydrates. Then the only difference between a type 1 and you and I is that their insulin comes from a needle and mine comes from my pancreas. But very sensitive to small fluctuations in insulin. And under those conditions, you can manage your blood sugar very closely, very tightly. Because when we talk about A1C, A1C is the attachment of sugar to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells. And it permanently attaches, and it damages that hemoglobin. And we can measure that as a percentage of damaged cells. So when we talk about a hemoglobin A1C of 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, that is the percentage of your red blood cells that have been permanently damaged by the attachment of sugar. So it's just a fraction. It's a percentage of your red blood cells. Now, the way it works is the average red blood cell life is 120 days. So those cells are damaged, permanently damaged for 120 days. And then your A1C will go up or down based upon your blood sugar, which then attacks more of the newer ones or fewer of the newer ones. And the ideal A1C, which represents a point at which your blood sugar is no longer causing inflammation in your body, because that's what sugar in the blood vessels causes inflammation. And then the inflammation attracts fat that causes the heart attacks and the strokes and the blockages of the vessels. Well, the threshold at which your blood sugar, your average blood sugar, no longer causes or does not cause vascular inflammation is around 5.2.
Wow.
Most endocrinologists are happy with an A1C below 7, which is a logarithmically elevated blood sugar. And so they're happy with these people killing themselves because their advice is poor.
And it's like, well, that's the best we can do. So there we go.
Exactly right. So the advice is eat this amount of carbohydrates and then use your insulin to get rid of it. That's like telling a heroin addict, you know what, shoot up, and then as soon as you start turning blue and trying to die, give yourself some reversal, some Narcan to reverse it. It's crazy.
Yeah.
If you don't use heroin, you don't need Narcan.
Yeah, it's kind of like they're trying to manage micromanage it. It's the same thing, like the best, because it's similar with the with that like whole 5 small meals a day. You know, the like low GI diet. It's like cool. After every meal you must take some insulin. So it's like eat this food that's going to push your blood sugar and insulin up, and then or put your blood sugar up, and then you're going to inject with insulin so that you're making sure that you're pushing it up and then pulling it down, pushing it up. But then you'll be in control, 100% control all the time.
Right, but you see, that's defying human biology, because human biology is very tidal. The hormonal system works on a homeostatic or a negative feedback system. So when something goes up, something else should push it down, and that typically happens around twice a day, very tidal. And human evolution is very closely tied to marine biology, which is interesting. We can talk about that a little bit. But so our tidal biology is that you should have a rise in insulin about twice a day during meals. But for the majority of the time, insulin is not the dominant hormone. For the majority of the time, it's glucagon. So glucagon is the hormone that releases your stores. So when you eat a meal, insulin shoves that into your stores and builds your tissue. It's a growth hormone. Insulin is one of the 2 big growth hormones. There's 4 of them. There's insulin, human growth hormone, testosterone, and T3, thyroid hormone, are your growth hormones. So they're anabolic. They're growing tissue. And that should happen twice a day for a short period of time. But then for most of the rest of your day, you should be in what we call catabolic state, where you're breaking tissue down, you're breaking your stores down, you're living off your own fat cells. And the problem with those multiple small meals a day, I call that snacking. And what it does, it keeps your insulin going up all the time, so you never get a chance for that ebb and flow.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if you had 5 tides a day, every time it's high tide 5 times a day? It would destroy the coastline, and that's what it does to your body. So multiple human beings have actually biologically distanced themselves from that way of eating. Cows do that, gorillas do that. Their gut and their intestine is designed to do that. Their low nutritional yield vegetarian food has to be eaten in abundance over a long period of time because it's a fermentation process. Fermentation doesn't happen instantaneously, but humans have shifted their biology to being primarily enzymatic in their digestion. So we can consume a bolus of food, it goes through our small intestine slowly, gets enzymatically digested over the course of about 8 to 12 hours, maybe 8 hours. So if we've got a window of eating, like most people will feed their dogs once or twice a day, same principle. You feed yourself once or twice a day. Even if you're an athlete, you don't need, because we're so good at storing stuff, you don't need to be eating that often. You don't need to be overpowering yourself. Everybody thinks more is better. Well, there's a threshold for everything. You look at something like protein, there's a threshold for protein. Nobody knows what that threshold is. Everybody loves to tell you how much protein you should eat. Nobody knows. But your body knows exactly what that is, because it shifts every day. It's different every day. And it's more different if you're female, because females are not only going through the cycle. Males are testosterone driven, although testosterone levels fluctuate through the day, according to the same thing. Females are going through estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone cycling. So it's a whole added layer of complexity. But nobody knows. The point about all of that is it's too complex for any human being to ever be able to decide how much protein you need on any given day. So you've got to say, okay, I'm going to eat a little bit more protein than I need each day. I'm going to overdo it slightly, knowing that the extra protein is going to become sugar.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's why I'm interested in you mentioned carnivore as like the holy grail. And
well, it's the holy therapeutic grail. You've got to throw the word therapeutic in there, because carnivore is not necessarily a lifelong sustainable diet.
Okay, so tell me about the context you see it in.
Okay, so if the disease comes from chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, you got diabetes, you got hypertension, or your performance is lagging, you're now a Tim Noakes or a Bruce Fordyce who's shifted toward type 2 diabetes, and yet they're athletes or whatever it may be. It doesn't matter who they are. The therapeutic regimen, the way to correct that is to remove carbohydrates from your diet. And the most aggressive way to remove carbohydrates from your diet is the most carbohydrate eliminating diet is a pure carnivore diet. And that is the most rapid way. It still takes about 2 years, but it's the most rapid therapeutic diet to restore normal human biology, to become what we call insulin sensitive, where you restore those two phases. However, if you do that over a long time, and it's a word we haven't used yet, something called fat adapting, where you're basically shifting your nutrition instead of using sugar and a little bit of fat, you're now using fat as your primary fuel source, and you really don't have a huge source for sugar. There are a few places where you have to have sugar, but it's very, very small. And for those cells, you need insulin to get the sugar into the cells. But if the cells are enjoying fat, because those cells can use fat or sugar, you really don't need insulin to get them in. So those people over time, they get to a point where they're insulin sensitive, where their health is about as good as it can be. But if they continue to do that and fat adapt beyond that, now you start to see their LDL go up, which is fine. No harm to that whatsoever. But it's a metric. If you're seeing that going up, you're seeing their blood sugar going up a little bit. You're seeing their protein numbers going up a little bit, the BUN, the uric acid, the creatinine going up. And the reason for that is because that extra protein is now being turned to sugar. Normally, they should be able to use that sugar, but that requires insulin. But because they're not producing insulin, they don't need insulin. At least they don't need it to control blood sugar. That sugar is hanging around in their bloodstream. The sugar levels are going up, and the liver is then having to turn that sugar to fat. So their triglycerides start going up. And that is because they don't have adequate insulin. So they're almost behaving like a type 1 diabetic.
Right.
Where they're just not producing it because they don't need it. The problem is that insulin is that anabolic hormone that does a whole bunch of growth things outside of energy.
Yeah.
And if you don't have adequate insulin, you're not building muscle adequately, you're not repairing your brain adequately. There are a number of abnormalities that happen when you start to become insulin suppressed. Basically, look at a type 1 diabetic, and we start to see some of those early things happen. So what you then have to do is to switch your diet from pure carnivore to adding back some carbohydrates once or twice a day to trigger insulin.
What kind of carbs are we talking?
Well, it depends. That's the thing. It depends on the individual, because we have to mitigate against carb. Let's say you are a 300-kilo person that now weighs 60, 70 kilos and are running marathons. Okay. No matter, and we see that. That's my practice. That's the average Joe in my practice. They call them LMHRs, lean mass hyperresponders, who've now found athleticism as or physical activity as their emotional outlet rather than crystal meth or carbohydrates. So what those folks then do is they start to see the numbers going off. So someone like that who isn't always will be a carb addict. I can't just tell him go and start eating sugar again, because they don't have the capacity to control it, and pretty quickly they're back up to 150 kilos. So for someone like that, we've got to find sources of sugar in their diet that don't trigger the addictive element. For other people, if you're just a power athlete and you want to improve your performance, but you find, oops, I'm insulin resistant, but you don't have, the reason you're insulin resistant is because you thought it was athletically better for you, carb loading, whatever it may be. Those folks may not necessarily have that problem. So, a guy like Tim is comfortable on a diet where he's eating 80 to 120, 130 grams of carbohydrates because he can control that. There's nowhere on God's earth I would ever be able to control that.
Yeah.
You tell me I've got to eat 6 blueberries out of a punnet. They're gone. Okay, I can't stop. And that's the difference with the addictive personality. So we've got to look at what the individual used to be, and give them carbohydrates to eat according to that. So in my household, we use dairy carbohydrates as a resource. For example, my 22-month-old son is 95% carnivore. He'll eat some tomatoes. He eats some cucumber. He eats avocado, which has a significant amount of sugar in it. And he'll also drink a bottle of full cream milk twice a day. And the milk has adequate sugar in it. That is a very, very powerful trigger for insulin. But for the rest, he eats meat. He's basically a pure carnivore for 95% of his diet, which is, to my mind, one of the healthiest long-term diets. But that's how we've come around it. Some people eat fruit. Some people, a lot of my Asian patients, my Filipino and Asian patients, will eat rice as their starch. Some folks will eat it. So it depends on the individual what they can manage. But the problem is you have to be able to control that, and that's where the challenge comes in.
What is your view on exercise? And like context here is we tell people it's not essential for weight loss because it makes you hungry and everything. But like I go mad if I don't exercise. And I find that I lose control of other areas of my life where there's discipline if I don't exercise. So for me, it's like essential, but not essential, if that makes any sense.
But you see, that's part of your life forever. If you were a concert pianist and you weren't allowed to play the piano, it would be exactly the same effect. And here's what's interesting, Jono, is that for most obese people, that's the relationship they have with carbohydrates. If they can't get them, they feel the same as you.
Yeah.
They get depressed, they get angry, because all of those things are very effective forms of emotion management. If you've had a rough day and you're all pissed off and angry and you go for a run, by the time you come back, you chill, you're relaxed, you're feeling good about yourself, and you've taken that stress and anxiety and you've left it on the trail. Well, people that eat a tub of ice cream do the same thing. People that shoot up with heroin or smoke cigarettes do the same thing. The concert pianist, the singer, they do the same thing. The artist, even the religious person who engages in some meditative praying, those are forms of emotional restitution. And that's exactly the wheelhouse that we work on, is that almost all the people that come into my practice, whether they're diabetic or obese or have other metabolic issues, are primarily using eating and drinking and sugar and starch as their source of emotional restitution. So when we take that away, we have to replace that with other sources of emotional restitution. So you're absolutely correct. It is ridiculous to think that exercise, which makes people very hungry, is going to be an effective way of long-term weight loss. However, physical activity is one of the 4 fundamental things we like our people to do if they're comfortable doing it, as an alternative, as a replacement for carbohydrates from the emotion management side. So it's kind of this duality. Don't ever assume that you can run on a treadmill and burn 1,000 calories and eat a tub of ice cream that's only got 90 calories. It doesn't work that way. But if you run on the treadmill and you're feeling good about yourself, now you don't need to eat the tub of ice cream to make you feel good. So it's an alternative resource. So it has value in carbohydrate addiction management. It really doesn't have a lot of value in weight loss. It's not about the calories. It's about the endorphin effect.
And does it strengthen your prefrontal cortex? Is that
absolutely? Well, it's not so much it strengthens it. It's a resource for the frontal. The frontal cortex is where all your emotions happen. And it is just so. Even throughout the day, I talk a lot with my hands, and that's just a way that I use to calm me down. You and I are both sipping on our coffee. That's I call that a mind cleansing moment. So we're focused on what we're doing, But the brain, it's like driving in the rain. The brain focuses and the rain's falling on your windshield, and then you hit the windscreen wiper when you reach a critical level of rain, and it cleans the windshield. Well, our brain is focusing. I have my little sip of coffee, gives me that little, and then my brain can chemically refocus. And it's a dopamine, serotonin cycling thing. We all need that. In the evenings, in the mornings, we put emotional money in the bank by something we do. So we either eat the cereal or the slice of pizza, or we go for a run, or we play some music. But we are all continuously putting emotional money in that frontal lobe bank. And you can spend it against life that throws curveballs at you, or if life was already throwing a curveball at you, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go for a run. The old me used to go and eat a tub of ice cream. The new me will go for a walk or a run. So we all have those resources. Now, the question for someone like yourself is, what would happen if you broke both your arms and both your legs?
I'd have to find something else. I'd become like a chess champion.
But the point is that as part of our therapeutic protocol, we have to take that into consideration, is to diversify. So while physical activity is your dominant thing, having other things available to you that you practice every day are, I believe, very important in case something gets taken away from you.
Because like connecting with other people and...
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Human connection is a very important part. So empathetic human connection is one, spirituality, meditation is another, creative arts is the third, and physical activity is the fourth. Those are the four pillars of a healthy emotion management system. And that gives, when we work with our carbohydrate patients, when you take away the carbohydrates, if they don't put other emotion management toolkits in place, that can be problematic. Good days are easy. Good days are opportunities to practice for a bad day. I'm not going to walk my dog on a bad day if I don't walk my dog every day. It's about habits. And so that's why we don't like the word diet, or we don't even look at weight loss as a metric. It's a byproduct. Because what you're transforming is obesity is not a disease. It's a way of life.
Yeah.
Your brain is continuously thinking of something to eat and drink. It's where you're going all the time for emotional risk. Whether you're bored, whether you're stressed, whether you're angry, whether you're happy, you're using that drug. Just like you do that with physical activity. And it's opportunistic. You know, you see an opportunity to go and jump on a bench or something like that, you do it. If the obese person sees the opportunity for a snack, they're going to eat it, even if they didn't intend to. And it's just what we do. You know, the smoker sees an opportunity to go out for a cigarette, even if they didn't want to or need it right then. It's just how we're wired. And effective obesity management is transforming that foundational emotion management system. And it's who we are as human beings. So you transform yourself from being the fat person to the runner, or from the fat person to the trumpet player, or to the religious person. It doesn't matter, but it's that transformation that secures or reduces the risk of relapse.
I got a question about that. So I found like one of the, I don't know if it's a frustration as much as just like a huge hurdle, is I'm obviously massively on this same page as you with emotional management. Sure. I have seen people lose weight and transform their health without going low carb.
How old are you, Jana? Let me stop. How old are you, Jana?
I'm 37.
Okay, 37. Let's say you're going to live to 100.
Yeah.
That means that this has to last for the next 63 years.
Yeah.
That's the sustainability that we're looking at. Most people that have done this have done it for a few years and haven't had a tragedy happen to them. Now, some people will automatically transform them. Some people automatically change their label. But you can sustain the weight loss 2, 3, 5 years with surgery, with a diet.
Yeah.
But see where those patients are in the second 5-year block.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen the stats; they're not good. But I think the question is really, how do you get someone from the mindset of like, even we've got people who acknowledge, they say, I'm an emotional eater. And then we say, okay, well, like, what could we run an emotional eating course? And then we say to them, cool, well, if you're an emotional eater, then we recommend this course. And they say, I think I'm going to go for the keto course with a 6-week meal plan. And we're like, but you emotional eater, that's the problem there, that you know how to do keto. You know how you've done it. You've used the meal plans, everything. Well, let's deal with the emotion. It's not really for me. I'm like, how do you sell that idea to someone? Like, you got to do something different. Like,
well, unfortunately, that's a voyage of self-discovery. And what I do at the outset with my patients is I have this discussion. They want to come in to find out how to do keto better or how to lose weight. And I always, in that first discussion, shift them backwards to connect with why they're. So you see, the people that want to do keto are changing what they're eating. The people that do emotion management are changing why. And the why always trumps the what. You know, I'll give you an example. If you want to run a 5K or you want to run a marathon or you want to do 2 oceans, how many people don't train their ass off to run the race and complete the race and then stop running? But everyone. Then most people do. And then there's a group of people who just love running. And sometimes they'll run a race, but most of the time, every day they're going out for a run. And they may be 80 years old and still out there because that is what defines them. And that's the difference. The majority of people do a diet to lose some weight, but it doesn't become a lifestyle for them. And but then there are the people who are low carbohydrate eaters as a way of life. And unless it becomes a way of life with other ways to deal with emotion management, it's not going to be sustainable. So if those people that are coming in for that, they want to do this eating plan for a particular objective. They're looking to lose weight. They're looking for a therapeutic advantage. And absolutely, I'm not bashing that. It's the best therapeutic advantage. But then what happens? What happens if you've lost the weight? What happens after the diet? What happens after you've lost the weight with a surgery? What happens afterwards? And if it doesn't become a transformed lifestyle, it's slowly going to creep back. Eric Westman uses a beautiful phrase. He calls it carb creep. And you start to see, okay, now the blueberries are on the fridge. Now the bananas are on the fridge. They're still healthy carbohydrates so, you know, I'm not eating Big Macs and ice cream, but it doesn't matter. They've crept back in. And the primary reason they've crept back in. Right, exactly. So, you know, so the why is, if you're going to take that person that you just articulated that maybe wants to lose weight and wants to do a 12-week keto course to lose weight, they're trying to address what? And they're very, very distorted in terms of their recognizing of why. And you got to help them to break that barrier down. Because addicts have this incredibly powerful, sophisticated system of validating and justifying and minimizing and trivializing and rationalizing, distorting reality to, you know, I know I shouldn't eat ice cream, but right now for this valid reason, I'm going to. And it's not just about carbohydrate addiction, it's about any addiction. The smoker that's having a cigarette, the alcoholic that's having a drink, the guy who's got shin splints who's going out for a run.
That's like me. Like, I needed it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And you know, that's really, so it's not just the bad side. It can happen with anybody that's got nth degree behavior. But you know, what's interesting about what you do for a living, at least in one of your many hats, is the tall chef's hat, is that cooking and being a chef, preparing meals, is actually one of the fundamental creative arts. Yeah. So you don't have to, if you are an obese person, often you love to cook, but it's usually baking. And you can very readily make a shift toward cooking and preparing meals. I call it nouveau cuisine, or a kiddie's portion done by an interior decorator, which is, you know, you can spend a lot of time on the artistic side of cooking and still loving it, and yet not having a carbohydrate there. And one of the beautiful things about South Africa, and you probably, because you live here, you don't realize it as much. Most average restaurants, their presentation of food is better than most high-end restaurants in the US. Their presentation of food is spectacular. Wow. Just the way they construct the plate. It's beautiful. I mean, we were at an average restaurant last night, and I actually took photographs and put them on my Instagram page last night of how pretty the food was. I know it was beef cheeks, it was a Wagyu burger, and it was some salmon or some tuna.
Doesn't sound like an average restaurant, by the way.
Well, I mean, it was a pretty, it wasn't a high-end restaurant. It wasn't one of the super high ends. But this was a place where they had this on the menu, and it wasn't expensive by my standards, and yet it was the presentation was beautiful. It was really, really well done.
Yeah, so, there's an interesting piece I actually wrote in one of my other cookbooks. Actually, it's one I don't have a copy of, but it's called Low Carb Cooking, and there's this piece that Tony Robbins talks about where he talks about your 6 needs, and we all have a need for like contribution. We need to receive, to be significant. We need certainty, we need variety. And then he talks about these 6 needs. In fact, these days, like all of his programs are hinged on these 6 needs. I think that one of them is like love and connection. I think that's 5. I can't remember the other one. And basically what I wrote about is how cooking is one of the few things that you can do that satisfies all 6 of those needs, because you're contributing, you're feeling significant because you could often get praise. You can experience certainty in that your skill will produce like a specific outcome, but variety in that you can mix it up all the time. Love and connection obviously comes from sharing a meal with the people you love. So it's proper antidote to many different ailments one might be experiencing on an emotional level. And so it's like, I remember when Real Meal came out in 2014 or in 2013, and I remember we were doing all these talks in 2014. And one of the things that struck me was at a lot of the talks, when I was still like, I didn't really know how important cooking was at the time. So I was like introducing Tim at all of these talks. And I thought everyone was just here to hear about the science, and I'd be sitting on the sidelines. And then people started coming to me and they said, because of your recipes, my husband and I have started, we've relit our passion for food. And so that was something I heard a lot. And then she said, not she, like many people said, it's actually brought our whole family closer together, because on a daily basis, we sit down together and we have a meal of real food. And it's like there's more love in the home because now we're eating real food that we cook. I was like, damn, that's amazing. I think that's probably why I wrote the piece in my later book.
It's such an important thing. And what's interesting is our take on that. I love what Tony Robbins does with those 6 concepts. However, as you look at that, to take it one step backwards, ultimately addiction management is about a transformation of looking for external affirmation and having addicts typically have an external locus of validation. I'll explain that in a second. And a large part of addiction management is about internalizing and helping people to learn the process of self-affirmation. I'll put that in the cooking context in a second. So an addict is somebody, for a variety of reasons, for basically majorly 2 reasons, are unable to self-affirm. Either because they are not good enough, they do a lot of things, but instead of praising themselves for the effort that they did, they look at some ridiculous outcome metric that they underachieve to. So let's say you're going out for a run today and you're supposed to run 5 miles in 10 minutes. And you come back and you've done 4 miles in 15 minutes. Now I'm terrible. Look how pathetic I am.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, wow, look how cool that run was. So self-affirmation is based on the effort, not the outcome. And some people are raised to become outcome-based. So they always set outcomes for self-care, and they always fall short because the outcome is too high. So they're not able to self-affirm. So what they do is they perform for others. They do things for other people, looking for unconditional affirmation from others, or they seek out a product, a source of instant gratification that gives them that sense of relief, that sense of pleasure, but it actually, in fact, hurts them on the back end. Whether that's yelling, screaming, shouting, physical violence, or eating carbohydrates, it is a form of external validation, external relief that eventually harms you on the back end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
And no other human being can self-affirm on your behalf. However, when you do something, when you put effort into something, whether it's having a moment of prayer, whether it's going for a little walk or a run, it doesn't matter how long or how far or how fast, whether you cook a plate of food that you really get in touch with, that's self-affirmation.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't matter whether the omelet you just made looks like Bobby Flay made it for you or like your dog threw up on the plate. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you love doing it. And so often people will bake for others for the affirmation from others. Totally. What I look at when I see a chef prepare a decorated, pretty plate of food, we had calamari 2 nights ago, and they had this ring of olive oil around it. It was just, the plate looked so pretty. And yes, it was, I never met the chef. So she and I have no connection. But I know when that person made that plate of food, it made them feel really good about what they did. So that is a form of self-affirmation. Look what I've just produced. So what the cooking does is, if you're preparing a meal, yes, there's the love of the family, and family love is important. That's a part of healthy affirmation, and unconditional healthy affirmation. Wow, your food looks great. It tastes great. Not, but you left out the salt. But at the same time, it is, hey, look what I just did. And it's that the benefit of the enjoyment of the effort. Whether you go for a run and you feel great when you come back, or whether you make that plate of food, or you write a book that's really cool, that's self-affirmation, no matter what the critics say.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of addiction management.
Yeah.
And generally, people that suffer from abusive or addictive relationships are unable to unconditionally affirm.
Yeah. So how do you get someone to do that? Because often my response is like, because we try to get people, I mean, we do, and some people just do it. Some people are able to say, okay, I need to focus on the process, focus on intrinsic values, intrinsic rewards, take away external validation. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. And then they just click and they're like, oh, no, I'm just living for me in the moment. I'm present and everything's great. Right. But then a lot of people are like, cool, I'll be present and in the moment, but I still want the outcome and the praise. And this person's still an asshole, and they don't appreciate me and all this. We're like, yeah, but you're living for you now. And they're like, yes, yeah, no, I'm totally living for me, but that person still won't believe what I'm saying, and they still fight. You know what I mean? Like,
right. And you know, a woman by the name of Brene Brown, Brene Brown,
Love
she
her.
works in the space. She's excellent. And most people know who she is, even though they don't know her name. But she has her approach is wonderful. She works exactly in the space. One of the things that she always asks is, it's a question I use a lot, is, do you think every day the people around you, for the most part, are doing the best they can? First question. Second question is, do you think every day, for the most part, you are doing the best you can? And almost always, addicts' answers are no and no.
Yeah, everyone sucks and I suck too.
Right. And the reality is, so the answer, the correct answer is actually, yes, other people are doing the best they can. And yes, I do the best I can every day. The caveat is this: with the tools I currently have. So if my toolbox doesn't have a lot of tools in it, the problem is not that I'm not doing the best I can. The problem is I have limited tools. So my job is to expand my tool base. And my job with people around me is to help them to improve their toolkit. And then also realize that there are certain people that I work with, or whatever it is, that are never, ever capable of doing that job. So at some point, you make the investment to help people to do better for themselves, and then you got to move the rock or change that paradigm. So I know, for example, I will never, ever, run a mile in under 8 minutes. It's just not going to happen. But it doesn't mean I don't stop running a mile. So, I'm a slow guy. I've never been fast, but I love to run. And, if I'm doing a 9-10 minute mile, I'm proud of that. But it's really about running. It isn't about my distance. So I've had to give up. I've had to move that rock. I've had to say, look, you're never going to run an 8-minute mile. But that's okay. I'm okay with it because I still love to run. And that took me a year or two or longer to reconcile. So sometimes giving up on those outcome parameters is not immediate. Yeah. It can take time, or setting an outcome parameter for yourself that is imminently achievable and overdoable. It's better to underpromise to yourself and overperform than it is to overpromise and underperform.
So there's a line there as well, because so as a competitive, I don't know if I'm a competitive athlete. I suppose I am, but I don't compete with other people. But one of those things is like the goal. Just think about myself, like trying to let go of certain dreams. There's a line, I think, for competitive people where they think, okay, well, sure, I understand, like I might not, like now I'm too old to be a professional rugby player. Okay, it's not going to happen. Yeah. But like there are certain goals where you think, I'm sure that's possible, even though it's like incredibly hard. And then you decide, okay, is it a goal that I need to let go of to like give myself more happiness? Or is quitting on this goal actually quitting on myself and like letting go of it? Like, am I being soft? Basically, that's the other side.
And I hear, this is the subtlety of this, is because if you are a terrible person because you didn't run an 8-minute mile, then that has a lot of negative connotations.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you don't try really hard to run your fastest. But you've got to love what you did on that day, because you ran your fastest given the tools that you had on that day.
Yeah.
And, the wind might have been different. You might have slept badly, whatever it is. I still loved running. And, if it's a 10-minute mile or a 9-minute mile, I'm still really happy that with the best that I was able to do on that day. And that's self-affirmation. But if you feel terrible about what you didn't do, that's very erosive to your sense of self. So it's a subtle thing. I'm not saying don't be competitive. Hell, I'm very competitive. But my competition doesn't depend on a threshold.
Yeah.
I'm going to work, I'm going to do as best I possibly can. But more importantly, I've got to condition myself to love what I did do.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Something else that sort of sits alongside addiction is depression. And I've seen people battle with antidepressants actually physically or medically affecting how fast and how well they lose weight. Absolutely. But I'm curious about like where you are in that space. Like, how do you help people who are depressed? Are there different meds they can take that change their ability to lose weight? What do you do in that case?
So let's separate the two out. Every human being gets depressed. Every human being has anxiety. Every human being gets stressed. And here's the thing I tell everybody: nobody over a lifetime has more or less stress than anybody else. Nobody has more or less. It is not about how much it's not about how much stress you have. It's about how you deal with it, how you perceive it, and how you deal with it. And ultimately, it comes back to the concept of what tools in your toolkit do you have to recognize, to take your emotional pulse and recognize how you're actually feeling. Because the last person to know they're depressed is the person themselves, because they haven't been educated or parented or taught how to recognize how they're feeling. And a large part of the work that we do is, hey, get in touch with your feelings every day. Why are you standing in front of the fridge? Are you angry? Are you bored? Are you depressed? Are you stressed? What is the reason? And then step back from the fridge and go and do something that you love to do that gives you emotional restitution that will lift you out of the hole of depression. Because it's not about getting depressed. It's about staying there. And then what these folks need is medication to stabilize the platform. It doesn't get them out of depression. It just gives them, instead of treading water, they're kind of got a rock to stand on, but they're still depressed. Because you can only change your mood. You can only change your stress level, your anxiety level, your level of pleasure can only be changed based on what you do. And it's changing what you do and recognizing when you are early, seeing that emotion coming at you. There's a concept when it comes to anxiety, and anxiety and depression are very closely aligned. It's called flooding, where something just pisses you off, and then you allow it to just grow and grow and grow, and you ramp up and you ramp up and you ramp up. And it's because you didn't see it coming and you didn't divert. You don't have strategies to divert. One of the questions I ask a lot of my patients is, the last question I asked them in the first part of my interview: what do you do for fun? Well, about a month ago, I went for a walk on the beach. Well, and usually in that space, I draw a little cobweb. Because the reason they're fat is they're eating all the time. Why the hell do they need anything else?
Yeah.
And ultimately changing that cobweb for other resources. But it doesn't help to add physical activity suddenly as a resource if you can't benefit from it.
Yeah.
So, whether it's playing the trumpet or using physical activity to get you out of that hole of depression, a large part of it is understanding why you become depressed and why you can't get yourself out of that hole. It's not the cause of the depression, but why do I stay in that hole? And that's a fundamental part of the psychology of dealing with addiction. Why do I stay in that hole? Because I don't have the tools and I don't recognize it. Yeah. And the first thing is to have the ownership. You know what? I am depressed right now, and here's what I'm going to do about it.
Totally.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's kind of where my head's at, but it's nice to hear professional opinion.
But it's helping people to consciously recognize it. That's the key.
Yeah.
Because most people are feeling it, but they don't even know they're feeling it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that most of the people who come through Real Meal Revolution, I don't know if most is fair, but I think what happens when we start coaching someone, because it depends on which program you're on. So it starts with an online course, and then sometimes people go, they want coaching or, emotional eating, and we find out.
Let me stop you for 1 second. Let's circle back to the blue book.
Yeah.
How many parents ever connect their kids with their own emotions? How many parents ever ask the kids, well, how does that make you feel? Or how are you feeling? But not, how does that make you feel? Not in a sarcastic way, but connecting their kids to recognize what they're feeling. And then, okay, what are we going to do about that? It doesn't happen. It is a fundamental part of parenting historically, but it's gone. So what we do as parents is we offer solutions. Oh, you're crying, or oh, you're upset. Here, have a sweet. Here, you're upset. Have some ice cream. So we're giving them instant gratification as a resource to change a feeling without the kid ever understanding and being analytical of the feeling. When we deal with kids, especially our younger patients, our younger children, we often talk to the parents about connect these kids to how they're feeling. Ask them, how am I doing? How am I feeling? And also, what am I going to do about it? Because that's the caveat to it, is what am I going to do about it? Is now a time where I'm depressed, I'm going to sit in my favorite chair and listen to my Spotify music account? Or is now a time where I'm pissed off and angry, I'm going to go for a run? Or is now a time when I'm really happy and I'm going to take my wife dancing? What is my restitution for that feeling? But in order to do that, I have to know what that feeling is. And that is a childhood thing. You teach those kids, or kids learn that or unlearn that in their first 2 to 5 years of life.
Yeah, you get, and like the one thing that we deal with a lot is so we're quite emotionally in touch with our children, and we go out quite often and see other people's parents like shaming their children for crying. And you're like, look, the child's expressing its emotions, which it's trying to connect with. And what you're telling it when you tell it to stop crying is that it's not allowed to feel, and it should be embarrassed for having feelings, which is like a baby boomer. That's how like baby boomers were raised. So it's a huge thing. I mean, even that alone. I don't know if you know Kate Silverton. She wrote a book on parenting called "There's No Such Thing as Naughty." It's a brilliant book.
Yeah.
In fact,
I've heard of her. I don't know her personally. I don't know her work that well, but absolutely heard about it and heard good things about it. But that's exactly the concept. So you notice that we start out talking about eating and food, but the ramifications go all the way across to that. And a large part of who we are is based on our parenting. So a lot of the stuff is not genetic, but it crosses generational boundaries. Because the other Brene Brownism is that, and it's something we've adopted a lot, is that you get raised a certain way. The best you can do is to become that person, and then you raise your own kids the same way. So it crosses generations. And authoritarianism, permissive family patterns cross those generational boundaries. So, but every parent has an opportunity to intervene, both from a nutritional perspective as well as from a behavioral perspective. And the two are they're so integral that you can't separate them.
Sure. Can we change the subject a little bit?
Yeah.
And talk about drugs. So medication. So like, I'm just trying to put this picture together around surgery, because for me, surgery is quite a drastic move. And then there's real food. But somewhere between the two of those, there's fat burners, supplements, slimmers, appetite suppressants. And I suppose maybe they sit somewhere with antidepressants, but I'm curious about.
And there are some good drugs, right? There's some good drugs in the market. So I hear your tone, you're maligning them. Let's talk about the worst one, the surgery. There are people out there who, first of all, let me back up a little bit. The worst condition that you can do is to be morbidly obese or diabetic, because neither of those two diseases occur in isolation. They all have significant health parameters that both shorten your lifespan and make you sick. So those are the worst conditions to have. And you start with the simplest methods of improving those people's health, of helping them to help themselves. By the time most people to come to you and I, they're already experts at failing weight loss programs. Okay, that's a phrase I use a lot. They've tried them all. They can list them all. They may have done really well. Oh, I lost 90 pounds on Atkins, but now you're 300 pounds again. So, they've done well with diet methodology, but they haven't changed the underlying root cause. That's a piece of it. Having said that, there are certain people, not that many, not as many as get surgery. See, most people get surgery as an alternative. Well, screw it, I don't want to do a diet anymore. I failed all of them. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have surgery to do it on my behalf. Terrible, terrible mistake, because it's going to fail. Because you're basically taking the same person and preventing them from eating. You can take that same person, lock them in a prison, and give them, salmon and steak twice a day, and they will lose a ton of weight, because that's the equivalent. So it's basically what surgery does. It reduces quantity and frequency. It doesn't change quality, and it doesn't change the relationship. Sure. So the surgery should be an adjunct. That's the first thing. However, at the same time, if you've got someone who's, let's say, 65, they're now in renal failure, or they've had 2 heart attacks, or their health is very brittle, they could lose that weight over five years on a ketogenic diet, or reverse some of that disease, but they're going to be dead before that time. Yeah. So you may want to change that early on. A 300-pounder is not going to go for a run, but if they drop down very quickly, they lose 70, 80 pounds. Now their brain, their bodies can think a little bit more like that. And I've been that guy. I've been that 300-pounder. I'm now the 200-pounder. So it's easier for me to do that kind of thing. So surgery has a place, but it is a last resort, not a first resort. And it should always, in my opinion, be in conjunction, a partnership with a patient, where they're addressing their behavior and the surgery is a tool to help them. So that's the way that works. Working backwards, the weight loss or the appetite suppressant industry is an awful industry that is primarily leveraged by people trying to con you. It's snake oil. It's leveraged by a bunch of prescribers who tell a very slick story. And I call that space the wallet biopsy space, where basically at the end of the day, the only weight you've lost is the rands or dollars from your back pocket, whatever that weighs. Because the HCGs, the phentamines, all of those things are really problematic. People lose weight with them, but ultimately it doesn't address anything, and they have the potential to make you sick. Now, in my own practice, from time to time, I will use phentamine as a short-term stabilizer for 20 days, 30 days, when someone's just totally out of control. When they are just totally out of control, it gives them a level of control. It basically gives them a starting block. But
what is phentamine?
Phentamine is the old fen. It's an appetite suppressant.
Okay.
It's amphetamine. It's a stimulant, but it's one of the most powerful appetite suppressants out there. So I will sometimes, rarely, but not often, medicate with a medication as a means of gaining control when someone's totally out of control.
Got it.
And that is sometimes, it's like, and I know it's going to be a horrible example, but when someone's hysterical and you slap them, that's kind of how I look at fentanyl, if that makes sense. Okay, you're not going to sit there and keep beating them, but you just want to get their attention.
Yeah,
and I'll say, right. So, and this is typically people that have done well to begin with, and their father died, or they got in a car wreck, and they just all over the place, or they had the heart attack and they fell apart. I would use that to get them back on track a little bit more quickly. It's an appetite suppressant, and then really work intensely with them, because you never do a medication without intensive therapy at that time, because the medication is always an intervention because something bad is happening or persisting. So to start with medication on your weight loss journey, I think is an error. I think that's a big mistake. I really think you want to start the hard work, rolling up your sleeves and doing the tough work of change, and then adding things in if you need them. So the appetite suppressants are a problem for me. The B12 shots, the HCGs, all of those medications are wallet biopsies. Those are used by shot. They've now got this thing called Plenty in the US, which is a pill that you take that expands in your stomach and makes you feel full early. Oh yeah, it's advertised very widely. It's got multi-million dollar support in the US, and it works. It works for a little while, but for a month or two. But now you've spent thousands of dollars on something that it's like a treadmill for most people. They go out and they buy the treadmill for a few thousand rand, and they run on it for 2 days. Then, my ankles hurt, and then the treadmill becomes a coat hanger. Well, I can sell you a wire coat hanger for a hell of a lot less. But what I tell people is do the work first, and then invest in something else. So drugs are a little bit like a treadmill, in that if you hate to run, the treadmill's not going to make you run. Yeah. Okay. But if you love to run, if you learn to run, and now it's cold outside and you want to run indoors, or you want to pace yourself a little bit better, then go out and buy the treadmill. Same as golf clubs. Don't go. I get so many people that go out and they buy the most expensive golf clubs, and then they take them to the driving range. They whack a few balls. They suck at it. This is terrible, and the golf clubs are sitting in the garage without any value.
That's so hard.
Don't start with the weight loss medications. But most programs are built on the foundation of instant weight loss. Almost all diet programs advertise lose 28 pounds in 20 minutes. And we've got the formula. And it's always, this is our eating plan, and then take this drug. And the drug will have that effect for a few days. But where are you at 2 weeks? Where are you at 8 weeks? Where are you at 12 weeks, 20 weeks? And and it's always attached to an exorbitant fee because they tell this beautiful story. So it doesn't matter what the medication is. It doesn't matter what calorie restrictive diet, like a Weight Watchers or Nutrisystem or whatever it is. They all fall into that same category. They may have some value down the road, but right up front, they don't have value. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, like exogenous ketones. Are those? Where do those fit in the world for you?
So let's talk about MCT oil, bullet coffee,
all the keto class of
Right. Yeah. They also have very useful effect as a diet. So we use them from time to time. I actually use them mostly as brain food for people with a history of Alzheimer's, that kind of thing. However, what they do is they get you into ketosis. So they are a dietary form of appetite suppressant.
Yeah.
So they do have, there is some value to that early on. But if you're now doing, when you get stranded and you're still drinking a bunch of butter and MCT in your coffee, you're drinking your calories. You don't need those. And the issue is not to get into ketosis. I can get someone in ketosis in a couple of days by feeding them oil. You really want your ketones to come from your own fat. So the keto oils, the keto coffees, the additives, the keto esters, whatever it may be. And I'm not talking about the athletes. That's a different discussion, which we can get into if you want to. And the value there is far less than advertised. But not an unreasonable thing to try, but really you should get that from your food.
Yeah.
Add some butter to your steak. Don't add butter to your coffee. Some people love it. Some people swear by it. It's more the placebo effect than anything else long term. I'm not against it, but I don't use it in my own practice. However, there is a group of medications that are on the market now that are very, very powerful. Because remember what I said earlier on, all of these diseases, the eye of the needle is something called insulin resistance.
Yeah.
And there is a medication that alters the hormonal effect of this. The early medication we used was metformin. And metformin, we still don't know what it does, but it really suppresses glucose release by the liver. So it's basically, the other day, it was kind of funny. I went to my mom's property and it was raining, but because it was Monday, the gardener was out there watering the plants. Didn't make sense. Okay. So what metformin does, by the time you are insulin resistant, the liver is actually producing sugar, even though you're eating a ton of sugar.
Yeah.
It's basically the liver is adding sugar to a storm that's already happening. So what metformin does is it reduces the production of sugar by the liver. And then you have to change your consumption of sugar. So metformin is a drug we use a fair amount for both our diabetics and our non-diabetics because it's really there for insulin resistance. And for some people, it works well. Berberine is something that's heavily advertised, and a lot of my patients buy it on the internet, and it's got this hype story. It just doesn't work effectively. Berberine, B-E-R-B-E-R-I-N-E, heavily advertised in the US as a homeopathic drug to treat insulin resistance and diabetes. It has a little homeopathic effect, but it really is a fart in a thunderstorm. It's not something that, for the price you're paying for it and for the investment, it really doesn't have an effect. So berberine is okay to take early on, but you're probably wasting your money. It's an alternative to putting hard work in. Metformin does have value. I use it from time to time, but it's a little bit better than berberine, but really not that powerful. And in fact, it actually has a secondary appetite suppressant. It makes you feel like crap. A lot of people gives them a lot of GI upset. But then there's a class of medication that is, and I'm not a big medication guy. I take people off meds, don't add them. But there's a class of medication we're using a lot and very effective for both obesity as well as diabetes and the metabolic side. It's called a GLP-1 agonist. And the GLP-1 is a hormone that gets released by the stomach and by the intestine, as well as by the brain, in response to a carbohydrate meal that triggers insulin. It is also a satiety hormone that gets released early when you consume high fat. So, when you eat a fatty meal, oh God, I'm stuffed. One of the they're called incretins. One of the 4 or 5 incretins is GLP-1.
Okay.
And it makes you feel full early on. If you've got acid reflux or if you've got heartburn, the most common cause of that is carbohydrate triggering of GLP-1. So when you over-trigger GLP-1, it makes you feel like crap. It gives you heartburn. It makes you feel kind of nauseated, that irritable bowel syndrome thing. And that's why getting rid of carbohydrates is so effective at getting rid of acid reflux for most people. However, what GLP-1 does also, it's a very powerful brain appetite suppressant. And I've used it myself just as a trial. I like to try these medications myself to see what they do. And I would literally sit there with a plate of food and say, I don't feel like eating. Yeah. So it's an incredibly powerful centrally acting appetite suppressant. Secondly, it blocks glucagon. It's a very, very powerful blocker of the release of glucagon and therefore the release of sugar from the liver.
Okay.
So it's better than metformin in that regard. And the most important thing is because of that glucagon effect that triggers insulin release. It is the hormone from the gut that triggers insulin release. And this is an important thing that very few people really understand. And we're just starting to get a grip on it right now based on blood work from my practice. The conventional thinking is that elevations in blood sugar trigger insulin release.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's false.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
That's false. So if you're a pure carnivore and you eat a big steak and 3 hours later your blood sugar goes up, your insulin stays flat. It doesn't respond. And it doesn't respond because of glucagon. Okay? Because glucagon is turning all that protein into sugar, while glucagon suppresses insulin. So you don't get, and that's the problem with the veteran carnivores. They're not able to clear that sugar.
Yeah.
So you have to trigger insulin. And the way you trigger insulin is through carbohydrates, through GLP-1.
Okay.
So GLP-1 is a very important hormone that we fairly recently discovered, and we're only now starting to learn its importance. So there are medications on the market that are called GLP-1 agonists. They trigger excessive release of GLP-1 in relationship to diet. And the common ones right now are given as a once-a-week injection. So the trade names are Ozempic, Trulicity, Rybelsus. There are a few others on the market. There's some that are daily injections. But that is a drug that I do use, not uncommonly. I always start my patients out on their dietary approach and slowly get them to shift toward a ketogenic or a low-carb diet. Not all at once, but slowly. If you want to add the oils, you can. You might want to start there. But increase your fat consumption, decrease your carbohydrate consumption, keep your protein consumption fairly consistent. Then we get blood work on those patients. And then based on the blood work, if they're profoundly insulin resistant, we may add in a GLP-1 agonist.
So the GLP-1 agonist
very, very well.
Yeah, so that's interesting because there's this thing in Cape Town, especially. In fact, I know 3 people. I don't think they know that I know, but they are taking the injections, and some of them are taking it once a day, and some of them taking it once a week, and it's an appetite suppressant. So that must be the
well, if that's what they're selling it as. There's something called semaglutide, which is a combination GLP-1 agonist and a GIP antagonist. GIP is one of the other incretins, and the two of them together work. They're really not primarily appetite suppressants. They work that way a little bit. So you do see some weight loss. But the more important the reason I use it is not for the appetite suppression. I use it for the insulin resistance block, for the improvement in insulin resistance. Because I don't care about how fat you are. I care about how sick you are. And there's a difference.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so those are drugs that, number one, work. Number two, they're very safe to use. And that profile is important, but they do work a little bit alone, but the effect is not meant to be alone. It's meant to be in conjunction to accelerate the improvement in your health. So it is that intermediary. So you can go progressively cold turkey, low carb, which is the ideal way to do it.
Yeah.
You can then add in some of the GLP-1 agonists, or that with or without metformin. And then thirdly, you can do the surgery. The problem is, like all these medications, the charlatan doctors are just going to prescribe the medication with some mumbo jumbo fancy story about diet. And because the drug works, everybody loses a bit of weight, but then it fails.
Yes.
And the problem is that all these things fail if you don't use it as a tool to make changes. So it should be in conjunction with a program if you're going to use it. But all the other, the other drugs, very, very rarely use them. Really are, when my patients are on them, I stop them right away. This is a drug that I do like to use. And while it was originally designed for diabetics, we now realize that the beneficial space in the weight loss metabolic syndrome management, it has a very powerful effect.
That's insane. So, okay, so one of the things that's not, look, I haven't actually seen the pack at all. I've just heard about them. And obviously, our approach is basically food only, and then if you need surgery or whatever, we'll just refer and send you to other people. So we don't really.
Right. Well, you see, I would, what I would do is that I wouldn't refer them out for that.
Yeah.
What I would do is to say, look, your surgeon needs to be your surgical technician. Your doctor needs to be your medication technician. Yeah. I'll give you an example. Okay. If you have mental health issues, the psychiatrist typically prescribes the medication, but they don't do therapy. The psychologist may do the testing to identify stuff, may do a little bit of therapy, but the mental health counselor, the social worker, whatever it is, that's where the bread and butter is. That's the mental health counseling. And that's really the team that we have. And, you would be one part of that team where you do the counseling, you do the day-to-day management, the transformative management of helping the person to help themselves. Because that ultimately, without that, nothing really changes long-term. Then the surgery can be outsourced to a surgeon. They come in one day, they have the surgery. It's a technical thing that you can then manage on top of that. But if they go from you to the surgeon, they're going to be put on the calories in, calories out. They're going to be set up with the ideal way to fail. And that's criminal to me. Yeah. Does that make sense? And by the way, I fix a lot of gastric bypass, which is the most popular surgery. It is an awful surgery. If anybody hears about it, please run away. And most surgeons will recommend gastric bypass as the best surgery out there. Because yes, it has the best upfront weight loss because you can't eat and you can't absorb your food. But starvation and metabolic derangement, you got to live with that long term. You're going to lose the weight in 1 or 2 years, but you got to live the rest of your life. In your case, 67 years or 63 years with a consequence of that surgery. That is not a good thing if the surgery is getting you to be a metabolic train wreck.
Yeah.
So run away from bypass.
You said
sorry?
Metabolic derangement.
Metabolic derangement. So you can't absorb your stuff. It's a malabsorptive surgery. So you don't absorb what you eat. There are surgeries out there that restrict how much you eat, but everything you do eat gets absorbed. Then there are surgeries. That's something like a sleeve gastrectomy or the old lap band and the intragastric balloons. Those are three that all they do is reduce quantity. They quantity and frequency controls. But the more popular surgery with the surgeons that I don't believe understand obesity, they understand weight loss, but they don't understand obesity, and they're different, are the magic bullet doctors that will offer gastric bypass or duodenal switch. Now, interestingly, duodenal switch has kind of been banned in this country. Very popular in the US because, basically what you're doing is you're sewing someone's mouth to their arsehole. So you eat and you poop it right out. Okay, so you put it in your mouth. You don't change that behavior, but it comes right out. It doesn't get absorbed. Great for calories or for carbohydrates, but not good for your micronutrients, for your irons, for your folates. So you become micronutrient deficient, and you become a metabolic train wreck because of that. Not immediately, but 4 or 5 years later when you've even forgotten what the name of your surgeon is.
Wow.
And these are not people that are charlatans. They just don't understand and have never needed to understand obesity because they're so good at weight loss. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to use that as a mechanism for weight loss, if you're going to use a medication for weight loss, do it in partnership with someone that understands obesity or diabetes. And that would be someone like you. So they need to partner with you rather than use that surgery as an alternative strategy.
Yeah, wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I got a sort of final topic. I don't know how much time you got.
I'm good with time. Yeah.
I'm just putting a timestamp in there. I try to go on mute just now and clear my sinuses with a big sniff, and I didn't push mute. So I'm gonna cut that out too.
You can edit that out. But yeah, you can break this discussion up into various sections, into segments.
Yeah, that's a goodie. So the thing I wanted to chat about was actually this article that came out in the UK this week, which is now like early July, and the Kellogg's lost an appeal to the. I don't know if you know about this, but basically
I don't know about this. I've been traveling the last week or so.
So it's really cool. The UK have passed a law where you're not allowed to advertise breakfast cereal to children anymore.
Wow, that's huge. That's very progressive. That's
huge.
Fantastic. Good.
So cereals that are high in, I think it might be all products high in sugar, salt, and fat, and they have their own threshold for what high means. But basically, Kellogg's fought back, and they're like, no, this is crap, because when you add milk to cereal, it becomes healthier. And the court threw it out. They were like, that's total crap.
Well, that's like, the water in my whiskey makes it healthy.
Exactly. And so, it's a landslide moment in the courts, because I don't think that Kellogg's like to lose very much, and I don't think they lose very often.
They're too powerful
really
to ever have lost. Right. Kellogg's and those companies are too powerful to ever have lost anything, because their lobby ability, and they don't understand the meaning of losing. It's a little bit like the All Blacks 10 years ago. They never lost. So when they did lose, they collapsed and fell apart, which was nice for the Bucks. But
absolutely.
The same thing with these guys is they don't know how to lose. And this is the sad part about it. There is nothing, no low level that they'll stoop to change. I'll give you an example of what Coca-Cola did in Mexico a few years ago. Mexico was proactive. They banned, people can straighten out the story. This is off the top of my head that I'm telling the story, but they were very proactive. They banned the use of glucose in things like Coke and that kind of thing. So what did Coke do? They changed their formula and they changed it to fructose, because they said it was glucose. They basically produced the same product, changed the recipe to use one sugar, not the other, and they were kind of screwed, because Mexico is one of the fattest countries in the country.
Gary Fettke would argue that fructose is worse, hey?
Fructose is worse. I agree completely. Fructose does not trigger insulin as much as glucose does. Wow. So that's one of the reasons why my son drinks milk as his trigger for insulin, because it's got glucose and galactose in it. All the other sugars are typically glucose and fructose. But to come back to the Kellogg's argument, I think that is a wonderful, wonderful start. I think it's a big, big deal. And it's really the government sending a message that, hey, we are starting to see the awareness of sugar. The biggest challenge for us with the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Committee, the USDA, put out every 5 years, they put out their guidelines. And just last year, in 2020, 2 years ago, they put out guidelines for the first time ever for kids under the age of 2. And basically, you're looking at 55+% carbohydrate diet, when to my mind, it should be below 10 to 15%. So they are, and they have had analyses done of the effectiveness of low-carb diets, and yet they've refused to even consider that entire bulk of work. What they do is they outsource projects. Go and look at this topic, go and look at this topic, and then you present those topics to the committee. Well, they outsourced the looking at low-carb diets, and there were over 50 meta-analyses, 50 studies that were done that were supposed to be presented to these guys. And in fact, one of the people on the committee was one of the people that directed that. And when the committee convened, they refused to consider that body of work. So they maintained the statement that there are no studies, at least of 2020, there are no studies that recommend low-carb diets as being healthy, that demonstrate that low-carb diets are beneficial. Yet their own subcommittee showed that there are 50 papers that say yes. So
it was thrown out.
They basically didn't even consider it. They didn't consider all the people that went up, like we did a few years ago, that said, hey, stood up. It was an open session where you had 3 minutes to go and talk. And thousands of people spoke about carbohydrates, and they just ignored that entire body of work. So that was one of the reasons we established something called the SMHP, the Society for Metabolic Health Practitioners, so that we are a big group that now represents between 300 and 400 physicians or practicing healthcare workers as a single unit with a single voice, because you've got to be a lobby group. And the problem with the cereal manufacturers, the Kellogg's, they are a big lobby group with a lot of money. So there's no way on God's earth that'll ever get passed in the US.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of what just happened. About 60% of kids in American high schools, certainly in Florida, vape on a regular basis. You know what vaping is? It's nicotine, electronic
vaping,
e-cigarettes. Yeah. And the commonest one is Juul, which they market specifically to kids, bubblegum flavors and all that kind of thing. And the government took this very seriously. They convened a committee. The committee recommended banning Juul. So they established a ban on Juul, and it was supposed to go into effect about 2 weeks ago. And Juul protested, threw a lot of money at different congressmen, and they delayed the ban indefinitely. So indefinitely for now. You know, they say, oh, we're going to relook at it. We've got to consider the other. But basically what they've done is they've just said, well, we came right up to the front door, but we didn't knock on the front door. We didn't open the door. And literally hundreds of thousands of young adolescents are now addicted to nicotine. And one puff of Juul has about 5 times the amount of nicotine as one puff on a cigarette. So, but this is lobbying. This is, you talk about the Kellogg's article, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to do exactly the same thing. And that's the challenge.
That is a massive challenge. Lobbying, here you also bribe politicians in South Africa, but we're nowhere near as efficient. Like there's no official lobbying.
No, lobbying is an industry in the US. It's a huge industry. And in fact, I was talking to my son, who's at Georgetown doing foreign service work at Georgetown. So they work a lot within and then outside of the government. A lot of these guys will go into the government as young people, write the laws, and then leave the government and go and join Kellogg's to figure out what the loopholes in the laws are that they created. That's a huge industry. Okay, a friend of his is an attorney who's just gone out of school, and he basically, now this guy was a Yale undergrad at Yale, Harvard attorney, and he basically said, well, look, we're going to write the law on this topic. I'm going to join the government. I'm going to work for the government, write the laws, and then I'm going to jump ship and go and work for this. It's a banking thing. Go and work for this bank, and we'll write the loopholes into it. That's how corrupt the system is. And then the banks are going to pay them millions of dollars of salary to leverage the loopholes in the system that they themselves wrote. You know, it's like you know, in the US we have a lot of tax people that help us to do our taxes that were formerly IRS tax people, so they know exactly where the loopholes are. And you know, I understand how that happens, but it's a questionable. So that's what Kellogg's is going to do.
Doesn't feel good. Well,
you can't trust these guys. But the fact that the Brits did that was hugely proactive. I've got to look at that.
Yeah, I think that they are of the first world nations. I sort of feel like they are the most progressive, even though they've obviously got their own stuff, but they do seem to be taking action. I think it was ever since Boris got COVID, and then there was such a strong link between obesity and COVID deaths. I think they started taking it quite seriously. And I mean, all the NHS doctors I've spoken to, they complain about, I mean, I think it's quite British to complain, but like complain about how slowly it's moving and everyone drags their feet. But, you know, compared to the other countries in the world, I think they're moving fast, like really fast, even compared to
at least they are not shifting the wrong direction. In the US, we are still shifting very much toward the plant-based, pro-grain, processed food lobbies. Yeah. And the shift hasn't happened at all. You know, we're now looking at decreasing animal farming and increasing plant-based farming. It's still very much upside down.
Yeah, interesting. Rob, I'd love to chat to you for ages, but we're going to have to call it here. So it's been amazing chatting to you, and I know that when people see this, you might be back in the US, but I hope you have a wonderful trip in Cape Town.
No, thank you very much. Again, we can seek out food so much better here. You know, the interesting thing, Jono, is this, that in the US, you've got to go out of your way to get healthy food. In this country, you kind of still have to go out of your way a little bit to get unhealthy food. The good stuff is much more readily available. So, no, I love being here, and thanks very much.